March 26, 1942, 1400 hours, Falmouth Harbour, Cornwall. 21 vessels slipped their moorings and turned toward the harbour mouth, beginning a voyage that would redefine the meaning of audacity in modern warfare. At the head of this unlikely armada sailed HMS Campbeltown, a destroyer that should have been scrapped years ago, her 4 funnels reduced to 2, her profile altered to resemble a German torpedo boat, her bow packed with 4.5 tons of high explosives concealed behind steel and concrete. Behind her followed 18 small craft, most of them wooden motor launches barely larger than pleasure boats, their mahogany hulls offering no protection against enemy fire, auxiliary fuel tanks mounted on their decks like bombs waiting to explode. Commander Robert Ryder stood on the bridge of motor gunboat 314, the headquarters vessel, watching his fragile fleet form up. Beside him stood Lieutenant Colonel Charles Newman, commanding officer of No. 2 Commando, a civil engineering contractor, turned soldier whose easy manner and constant pipe concealed a core of pure steel. Newman's men, 265er commandos drawn from 6 different units, were crammed into the motor launches and hidden below decks on Campbeltown. They wore dark clothing painted with white stripes for recognition, in the night fighting to come. Each man carried either a Thompson submachine gun, a Bren light machine gun, or for the demolition specialists, a single Colt 45 pistol and up to 90 pounds of explosives in their rucksacks. They were about to attempt what many at Combined Operations Headquarters privately considered a suicide mission. The target was St. Nazaire, a fortified port on the French Atlantic coast 400 miles from the nearest British harbour. The objective was the Normandie dock, the only dry dock on Europe's western seaboard capable of accommodating Germany's largest battleship. Winston Churchill had been haunted by a nightmare since May 1941. That month, the battleship Bismarck had broken into the Atlantic, sunk HMS Hood in minutes, and come terrifyingly close to escaping into the vast ocean where she could have devastated Britain's lifeline convoys. The Royal Navy had hunted Bismarck down and sent her to the bottom, but her sister ship Tirpitz remained. At over 52,000 tons after wartime modifications, Tirpitz was the heaviest battleship ever built by a European navy. She mounted 8 15-inch guns that could hurl 1,800-pound shells over 25 miles. Her armour belt was 14 inches of hardened steel. She could make 30 knots, and her mere existence tied down massive British naval forces that could not risk her breaking into the Atlantic shipping lanes. The Normandie dock at St. Nazaire had been built in 1932 to service the ocean liner Normandie, the largest passenger ship of her era. The dock's outer gate, called a caisson, was a massive steel structure 167 feet long, 54 feet high, and 35 feet thick. If Tirpitz were damaged in the Atlantic, St. Nazaire was the only port where she could be repaired. Destroy the dock, and Tirpitz would be trapped in Norwegian waters, her threat neutralised without firing a shot. The plan approved on March 3, 1942 was breathtaking in its simplicity and terrifying in its execution requirements. HMS Campbeltown would ram the caisson at full speed, embedding herself in the dock gates. Hidden in her bow were 24 depth charges, 400 pounds each, encased in concrete to prevent detection. Time pencil fuses would detonate them hours after the attack, when German forces had relaxed and begun investigating the wreck. Meanwhile, commandos would storm ashore and systematically destroy the dock's operating machinery. The pump houses that controlled water levels, the winding gear that opened the gates, the power station, the bridges, everything that made the dock functional would be blown to pieces. Then, if all went according to plan, the commandos would reboard the motor launches and race back to England under cover of darkness. The word if carried enormous weight. St. Nazaire was heavily defended. German intelligence reported over 6,000 troops in the area, including elements of the 333rd Infantry Division. Coastal defence batteries ringed the port with heavy guns. Anti-aircraft positions bristled with 20 metres, 37 and 40mm weapons. Searchlights covered every approach. The Loire estuary leading to St. Nazaire was shallow, treacherous, and studded with mud flats that could ground the attacking force miles from their target. The main ship channel was heavily mined and defended. RAF Bomber Command had promised diversionary raids to distract German defenders, but weather and operational priorities made that support uncertain. HMS Campbeltown herself was a relic. Originally USS Buchanan, she was one of 50 obsolete American destroyers transferred to Britain in 1940 under the Destroyers for Bases Agreement. At over 20 years old, she was worn out, her machinery tired, her hull weakened by decades of service. But she had one quality that made her perfect for this mission. She was expendable. Lieutenant Commander Stephen Beatty commanded Campbeltown with a crew of just 75 men, reduced from her normal complement to ensure everyone could evacuate when the ship rammed the dock. Beatty was 30 years old, unflappable, possessed of the kind of courage that appears as calm competence under fire. His task required threading a needle while being shot at from all sides. He had to navigate 5 miles up a treacherous estuary in darkness, avoid defensive fire that could sink his ship before she reached the target, hit the caisson at precisely the right angle and speed to embed the bow firmly in the gates, then evacuate his crew and the commandos aboard while under direct fire from point-blank range. The motor launches faced an even more precarious situation. Type B Fairmile motor launches were 112 feet long, displaced 65 tons and could make 18 knots. They mounted a single 20mm Oerlikon cannon and twin World War I-era Lewis machine guns. Their mahogany hulls offered no armour protection. The auxiliary fuel tanks strapped to their decks turned each boat into a floating bomb. 4 of the launches carried torpedoes. One was a motor torpedo boat with special delayed action torpedoes designed to explode hours after firing. These boats would transport the commando assault and protection teams to landing points around the harbour, while Campbeltown's demolition teams attacked the dock machinery. Then they would collect everyone and run for the open sea. The Atlantic crossing began uneventfully. 2 Hunt-class destroyers, HMS Tyndale and HMS Atherstone, escorted the flotilla across the channel, providing anti-submarine protection and ready to engage any German surface forces. A submarine, HMS Sturgeon, had departed earlier to position herself at the mouth of the Loire estuary as a navigational beacon. The weather was perfect, almost suspiciously so. Clear skies, calm seas, a full moon rising. Perfect for navigation. Perfect for being spotted by German reconnaissance aircraft. On the afternoon of March 27th, the convoy encountered a U-boat. Depth charges forced her to submerge, but she managed to transmit a contact report before diving. The British held their breath. If the U-boat's report was taken seriously, German forces at St. Nazaire would be on full alert. They got lucky. The U-boat commander, unable to hold periscope depth long enough for accurate observation, filed an incorrect position report. German intelligence concluded the convoy was headed south toward Gibraltar, or was conducting mine-laying operations. The threat was noted but not acted upon with urgency. The flotilla pushed on. At dusk they encountered French fishing trawlers. These vessels sometimes carried German observers disguised as fishermen. Commander Ryder could not risk them reporting the convoy's presence. Both trawlers were stopped, their crews taken aboard British vessels and the boats sunk. The fishermen would spend an uncomfortable night as prisoners but would live. At 2200 hours the force sighted the submarine beacon marking the Loire estuary entrance. HMS Tyndale and HMS Atherstone turned back toward England. From this point forward, the raiders were on their own. 2 more destroyers, HMS Cleveland and HMS Brocklesby, had been dispatched to meet them on their return journey, but that rendezvous was many hours and many miles away. The flotilla reformed into 3 columns and began the final approach up the Loire. The portside column of motor launches would land commandos at the Old Mole, the main pier. The starboard column would attack the old entrance to the basin. Campbeltown, in the centre, would ram the Normandie dock and deploy her assault teams directly onto the dock structure. Overhead, RAF. Bombers were supposed to be creating diversions, dropping bombs on the port to keep German attention skyward and away from the river. But the diversionary bombing never materialised properly. Low clouds over the target prevented accurate bombing, and Churchill's order requiring visual identification of targets before dropping bombs meant most aircraft returned to base with their load still aboard. The few bombs that did fall served only to alert German defences that something unusual was happening. At midnight, German harbour control detected unusual activity. Searchlights began probing the darkness. Coastal defence batteries went to alert status. At 01:20 hours, a German signal station challenged the approaching vessels. This was the moment of maximum vulnerability. Commander Ryder's plan included a bold deception. Campbeltown was flying German naval ensigns. A German-speaking signalman aboard the destroyer responded to the challenge with a recognition code captured from a German torpedo boat. He claimed they were German vessels proceeding to harbour after sustaining damage in action with British forces. It worked. For 17 precious minutes, the deception held. The convoy pushed deeper into the estuary, closing to within a mile of the Normandie dock. Searchlights continued to probe but held off from full illumination. German gunners remained at their stations but did not open fire. At 01:27 hours, the illusion shattered. A German signals officer, suspicious of the responding code's age, ordered searchlights to fully illuminate the approaching vessels. In an instant, 21 British ships were caught in a blaze of white light. Every searchlight in St. Nazaire harbour focused on them simultaneously. For perhaps 5 seconds, there was silence. Then the entire German defensive network opened fire. It began with the heavy coastal batteries, their shells raising enormous waterspouts around the motor launches. Then the lighter weapons joined in, 20mm and 40mm anti-aircraft guns depressing their barrels to rake the river at point-blank range. Blue-green German tracers and bright orange British tracers began crisscrossing the darkness in a lethal display. The motor launches were torn apart. Mahogany hulls splintered under direct hits. Auxiliary fuel tanks exploded in sheets of flame. Men were cut down on exposed decks. The river became a nightmare of burning wreckage, screaming wounded and sinking boats. But Campbeltown pushed on. Lieutenant Commander Beatty ordered the German ensign struck and the white ensign raised. No more deceptions. They were British, they were attacking, and they were going through. He rang for full speed. Campbeltown's elderly engines responded magnificently, driving her to 19 knots. German fire concentrated on her. Shells crashed into her superstructure. Her forward gun was knocked out. Men fell around Beatty on the bridge. He stood calmly at the helm, making minute adjustments to his course, aiming for the caisson. Lieutenant Colonel Newman stood beside him, watching his commandos below decks preparing to storm ashore, utterly exposed but unwavering. 4 minutes, 3 minutes. The caisson loomed ahead, a massive steel wall across the dock entrance. German machine guns firing from the submarine pens raked Campbeltown's decks. More commandos fell. 2 minutes. Beatty made a final course correction. 1 minute. At 1:34 hours on March 28, 1942, HMS Campbeltown struck the Normandie dock caisson at 19 knots. The impact drove her bow 9 meters onto the caisson, embedding her firmly at the dead center of the gate. The old destroyer shuddered and groaned. Her forecastle hung above the dock gate like a steel spear thrust into a giant's heart. Below her waterline, concealed behind layers of steel and concrete, 24 depth charges sat with their fuses already ticking. Beatty, bruised but uninjured, announced cheerfully to his crew, "Well, here we are, 4 minutes late." Behind Campbeltown, the motor launch force was being massacred. Only 3 of the 12 launches carrying Group 1 and Group 2 commandos managed to reach their landing points. Motor Launch 457 was the sole boat to reach the Old Mole and land its assault team. Motor Launch 177 reached the old entrance and successfully landed commandos who immediately planted demolition charges on 2 tugboats. The other motor launches were sunk, burning, or forced to turn back. Their crews fought with desperate courage, manning their light weapons against heavy shore batteries, rescuing men from the water, attempting again and again to reach the piers under murderous fire. Motor Launch 192 made 3 separate attempts to land commandos at the Old Mole. Each time she was driven back by concentrated fire. Her deck became a slaughterhouse. Wounded men operated her guns while standing in pools of their own blood. Eventually burning and barely afloat, she turned away into the darkness. Sergeant Thomas Durrant manned a Lewis machine gun on Motor Launch 306. When a German torpedo boat closed to engage, Durrant kept firing despite being wounded repeatedly. He continued to fire even after the motor launch was boarded and captured, his weapon still hammering out rounds as German sailors climbed aboard. He died of his wounds in German captivity. The recommendation for his Victoria Cross was written by the German naval officer who captured him. But on Campbeltown, the mission was succeeding. Lieutenant Nigel Tirpitz, the explosives expert who had designed the destroyer's hidden bomb, scuttled the ship to prevent Germans from moving her before the charges detonated. Commandos from Group 3 stormed ashore onto the dock structure and began their deadly work. Captain Robert Montgomery's demolition team attacked the northern pump house. These massive pumps could drain the dry dock in hours and were critical to its operation. Montgomery's men placed shape charges precisely on the pump motors, the impeller housings and the control mechanisms. The charges fired with precision. The pump house was reduced to twisted wreckage in seconds. Captain William Pritchard's team hit the southern pump house with equal efficiency. More massive pumps destroyed, more irreplaceable machinery rendered useless. Lieutenant Brett Burtonshaw's team attacked the winding house that controlled the dock's inner caisson. The huge electric motors that opened and closed the inner gate were demolished with surgical precision. Lieutenant Stuart Chant's team destroyed the power station and dock operating controls. Captain Donald Roy's team blew up additional pumps and dock machinery. Every demolition team carried detailed blueprints provided by British intelligence. Every man knew exactly which piece of machinery to destroy and precisely where to place charges for maximum effect. They worked methodically, despite German fire converging on their positions. Several were wounded, some were killed. But the demolitions continued with mechanical efficiency. Lieutenant Colonel Newman had landed from the motor gun boat, though he need not have gone ashore. He immediately took command of the chaotic battlefield. When a German gun position on top of the submarine pens began inflicting heavy casualties, Newman directed mortar fire onto it until the position fell silent. When an armed trawler attempted to engage the motor launches, Newman brought machine gun fire to bear, forcing it to withdraw upriver. The commandos who had landed fought magnificently. Protected by their assault teams, the demolition specialists completed their work. Every major objective in the dock was destroyed. The Normandie dock would be useless even if the Germans somehow defused Campbeltown's hidden bomb. By Brewster's 20 hours, the demolitions were complete. Commandos began moving toward the old mole for evacuation. Then they discovered the truth. Almost all the motor launches were gone, sunk, burning, or driven off by overwhelming fire. The old mole, their designated evacuation point, was empty. No boats waited to take them home. The survivors numbered about 100 commandos scattered across the dock area. They were surrounded by thousands of German troops now converging on their positions. They had no heavy weapons, limited ammunition, no hope of naval evacuation, and dawn was approaching. Newman gathered his officers. They could surrender or attempt to fight their way out. Newman's second in command, Major William Copland, was asked, "Shall we call it a day?" Copland, his entire team wounded, replied without hesitation, "Certainly not, Colonel. We'll fight our way out." Newman looked at the narrow iron bridge that was the only exit from the harbour area. German machine guns covered it from prepared positions. Crossing would be suicide. He announced, "Away you go, lads!" The commandos charged. With fixed bayonets and Thompson submachine guns blazing, they stormed the bridge. The shocked German defenders broke, under the ferocity of the assault. The commandos poured through into the town of Saint-Nazaire. For the next several hours they fought their way through the streets. They climbed over fences and rooftops. They scrambled through gardens and chicken coops in what would later be called the Saint-Nazaire steeplechase. They attacked targets of opportunity. They engaged German patrols in savage close-quarters combat. They tried to reach open country where they might have a chance of escaping to Spain. But by dawn, German reinforcements had sealed off the town. Roadblocks covered every exit. Fresh troops poured in from surrounding garrisons. Ammunition ran low. The wounded could no longer walk. Small groups of commandos found hiding places and went to ground, hoping to wait for darkness and another escape attempt. Newman and the largest group sheltered in a basement. They were exhausted, many wounded, ammunition nearly gone. When a German grenade bounced down the stairs but failed to explode, Newman made the decision. They had accomplished their mission. The dock was destroyed. Continuing to fight would only get more men killed. He announced their surrender. 109 commandos were captured that morning. They were treated correctly by German forces who recognized professional soldiers when they met them. The wounded received medical care. When German officers tried to separate Newman from his men, he refused. 5 commandos successfully escaped from Saint-Nazaire. With help from French resistance members, they made their way through occupied France into Spain and eventually reached Gibraltar and England. Each escape story could fill a book. Meanwhile, out on the river, the surviving motor launches were fighting their way back to sea. Motor launches, 160, 307, and 443 made it to the rendezvous point and waited for the destroyers. When German aircraft appeared overhead, they shot one Junkers 88 out of the sky and damaged a Blohm and Voss seaplane, driving it off. They eventually reached England the next day, battered but alive. The destroyer HMS Campbeltown sat wedged on the Normandie dock caisson, apparently just another casualty of a failed raid. German troops and sailors swarmed over her, looting what they could find. Word spread that the ship contained valuable supplies: chocolate, coffee, cigarettes. The crew cabins were ransacked. A German intelligence team arrived to examine the ship. They searched for documents, code books, anything of intelligence value. They found nothing suspicious. The hidden bomb bay was concealed so perfectly that even trained inspectors missed it. The commanding officer of the port arrived to inspect the stranded destroyer. A propaganda photographer took pictures for German newspapers. A salvage team began planning how to move the wreck. More than 300 Germans were aboard or near Campbeltown when, at 10:35 hours, she exploded. The detonation was massive. 4.5 tons of high explosives going off simultaneously created a blast wave that vaporized everything within 50 yards. The forward half of Campbeltown simply ceased to exist. The caisson shattered into twisted steel fragments. Water from the Loire poured into the dry dock in a massive wave, sweeping away the 2 tankers that had been inside. Over 200 Germans died instantly. More were killed by falling debris. The explosion could be heard for miles. A mushroom cloud of smoke and debris rose over Saint-Nazaire. German commanders were stunned. The British had not been trying to escape. They had been delivering a bomb. Panic spread through Saint-Nazaire. Were there more bombs? More delayed charges? German troops began firing indiscriminately at anything that moved. French dockworkers were shot. German soldiers fired at their own comrades. The paranoia lasted for hours. It got worse that night when motor torpedo boat 74's delayed action. Torpedoes exploded in the Saint-Nazaire basin exactly as planned. The British had struck again. More explosions, more panic. German forces completely lost control, firing into crowds of French civilians. 16 French citizens were killed and 30 wounded. 1,500 were arrested and interned. Their houses were demolished in retaliation for a raid they had nothing to do with. The final butcher's bill was grim. Of the 611 men who sailed from Falmouth, 169 were killed. 105 Royal Navy personnel and 64 commandos. Another 215 became prisoners of war, most of them wounded. German casualties exceeded 360 dead, most killed when Campbeltown exploded. Operation Chariot produced an unprecedented recognition of valour. 5 Victoria Crosses were awarded, more than any other single operation in the war. Lieutenant Commander Beatty received the Victoria Cross for ramming Campbeltown into the dock. Commander Ryder received the Victoria Cross for commanding the naval force. Lieutenant Colonel Newman received the Victoria Cross for his leadership of the Commandos. Sergeant Durrant and Able Seaman Savage were awarded Victoria Crosses posthumously. Another 84 decorations for gallantry were distributed among the survivors. The Normandie dock at Saint-Nazaire was not repaired until 1948. For the remainder of the war it remained useless, a shattered ruin. The Tirpitz never entered the Atlantic. Without Saint-Nazaire as a safe haven for repairs, sending her into the ocean was simply too risky. She remained in Norwegian fjords, a fleet in being that tied down British naval resources but never fulfilled her purpose as a commerce raider. British midget submarines damaged her in 1943. RAF Lancaster bombers finally sank her with 12,000-pound tallboy bombs in November 1944. The Nazaire Raid became known in British military circles as the greatest raid of all. It combined meticulous planning, extraordinary courage, and brilliant improvisation under fire. It achieved a strategic objective that altered the course of the naval war. And it demonstrated that even against overwhelming odds, audacity and determination could accomplish the impossible. In 1985, at a reunion of German and American pilots, a similar gathering of Saint-Nazaire survivors took place. German officers who had fought against the raid spoke with genuine respect about the British raiders. One German naval officer who had been at Saint-Nazaire said, "We could not believe anyone would attempt such a thing. When we understood what you had done, ramming an explosive ship into our dock, fighting your way through our defences, destroying our facilities, we knew we faced an enemy who would not be defeated." The survivors formed the Saint-Nazaire Society, a registered charity that maintains the memory of the raid. Memorials stand in Falmouth and Saint-Nazaire. The ship's bell of HMS Campbeltown was eventually given to the town of Campbelltown, Pennsylvania. as appreciation for the Destroyers for Bases program that made the operation possible. When the current HMS Campbeltown, a Type 22 frigate, visited St. Nazaire in 2011 before her decommissioning, the French town gave her an honoured reception. The raid sites are still visible. The Normandie dock, repaired at enormous cost, stands as testimony to what 611 men accomplished in one night of violence. The strategic lessons of Operation Chariot remain relevant. Small, highly trained forces with clear objectives can achieve results far beyond their size. Detailed intelligence and meticulous planning are essential. Courage alone is not enough, but courage combined with professionalism creates possibilities that seem impossible. The men who sailed from Falmouth on March 26, 1942, knew they were unlikely to return. They went anyway. They understood their mission's importance exceeded their individual survival. When the motor launches burned and evacuation became impossible, they fought their way through the town rather than surrender immediately. When ammunition ran out, they surrendered with dignity, having accomplished everything asked of them. The Atlantic Wall that Hitler would later construct, stretching from Norway to Spain with 15,000 bunkers, was supposed to make occupied Europe invulnerable to Allied attack. Operation Chariot proved that no fortification is invulnerable to determined men with a clear mission. The raid's success inspired other operations. The techniques developed for St. Nazaire would be used again at Dieppe, in North Africa, in Italy, and finally on the beaches of Normandie. The Commandos who survived St. Nazaire would go on to fight in every theatre of the war. Many would die in later operations. Some would survive to old age and tell their stories to generations who had never known war. In 2017, the last survivor of Operation Chariot passed away. The generation that fought the raid is gone, but the memory remains. In naval colleges and military academies, staff officers still study the operation. How did they achieve such complete surprise despite being detected? How did they destroy every objective despite losing most of their force? How did they maintain cohesion and fighting spirit when evacuation failed? The answers lie not in technology or tactics alone, but in the character of the men involved. From Commander Ryder, who commanded the fleet with coolness under impossible fire, to Lieutenant Commander Beatty, who drove his ship into the dock gates while being shot to pieces, to Lieutenant Colonel Newman, who charged a machine gun-covered bridge shouting encouragement to his men, to Sergeant Durrant, who kept firing until he literally could not pull the trigger anymore. The lesson of St. Nazaire is not that suicide missions work. The lesson is that clear objectives, detailed planning, professional execution, and extraordinary courage can overcome what appears to be insurmountable odds. The Normandie dock was considered invulnerable, 40 miles up a defended estuary, protected by thousands of troops, covered by hundreds of guns, illuminated by searchlights, defended in depth. The British destroyed it with one old destroyer and 18 motor launches. They paid for that success with 169 lives, but they achieved their objective so completely that the Germans could not repair the damage for 6 years. Today, tourists visit St. Nazaire and walk past the submarine pens that British bombs never managed to damage significantly. They see the harbour where German U-boats once sheltered. They visit museums that explain the port's history, and if they look carefully, they can find memorials to the men who came one night in March 1942 and broke the Atlantic Wall before it was even built. The Commandos who survived imprisonment found themselves in various German POW camps, treated as prisoners of war rather than executed as saboteurs, a testament to the raid's military legitimacy that even the Germans recognised. Lieutenant Colonel Newman spent 3 years in Offalygi Sea, better known as Colditz Castle, the supposedly escape-proof facility for difficult prisoners. He earned his place there by organising escape attempts from 3 previous camps. His reputation preceded him. When he arrived at Colditz, the German commandant remarked that Newman's presence was an honour, adding that escape from this fortress was impossible. Newman smiled around his pipe and began planning escapes anyway. He never succeeded, but his attempts tied down German resources and manpower that could have been used elsewhere. Commander Ryder was held in various naval officer camps. He used his time to memorise every detail of the St. Nazaire operation, knowing that if Britain won the war, a complete record would be needed. He kept a mental diary, adding entries each night before sleep, rehearsing the timeline, the decisions, the heroism he had witnessed. When liberation came in 1945, he could recite the operation minute by minute from memory. The men held in regular POW camps faced harder conditions. Many of the wounded never fully recovered. German military surgeons did what they could with limited resources, but infection, inadequate nutrition, and the stress of captivity took their toll. Some commandos lost limbs, others carried shrapnel in their bodies for the rest of their lives, metal fragments too dangerous to remove that would set off airport security scanners decades later. But survival brought its own questions. Why had they lived when so many friends had died? The survivors' guilt that would later be recognised as a component of post-traumatic stress was simply called bad dreams in 1945. Men woke screaming, seeing motor launches burning, hearing the screams of wounded comrades, watching Campbeltown explode again and again in their minds. There was no counselling, no therapy, no recognition that what they had experienced might require professional help. They were expected to return to normal life as if nothing had happened. Some managed better than others. Lieutenant Commander Beatty returned to the Royal Navy and continued his career, eventually retiring as a captain. He rarely spoke about St. Nazaire, deflecting questions with modest remarks about doing his duty. When pressed, he would mention his crew, the men who kept Campbeltown running under fire, the sailors who manned the motor launches knowing they were likely sailing to their deaths. He insisted that the Victoria Cross belonged to all of them, that he merely held it in trust. Commander Ryder left the Navy after the war and became a successful businessman. He wrote the first comprehensive account of the operation, published in 1947, ensuring that the full story reached the public. His book became the standard reference, used by historians and military analysts for decades. He attended every reunion of the St. Nazaire Society, maintaining contact with the survivors until his death in 1986 at age 88. At his funeral, former commandos who are now elderly men stood at attention one final time for the commander who had led them into hell. The French perspective on the raid remained complicated for decades. The immediate aftermath had been traumatic. German reprisals killed innocent civilians, homes were demolished, families were broken apart. The dock workers who died when Campbeltown exploded were simply doing their jobs under German occupation. They had no choice but to work in the port. Their deaths were collateral damage in a larger strategic game they never understood. But as the war's outcome became clear, French attitudes shifted. The raid demonstrated that occupied France was not invulnerable. It showed that the Germans could be hurt. It proved that resistance was possible. When news of the operation finally reached Free French forces in London, General Charles de Gaulle personally praised the raiders, noting that their courage had given hope to occupied peoples everywhere. The destruction of the Normandie dock, originally built as a symbol of French engineering excellence, became a point of pride rather than shame. Better the British destroy it than leave it for German use. After liberation in 1944, St. Nazaire's citizens erected their first memorial to the raid, a simple plaque noting that British forces had attacked the port on March 28, 1942, destroying installations vital to the German war effort. The plaque mentioned the French civilians killed in the aftermath, ensuring their sacrifice would not be forgotten. Over the years, additional memorials appeared. A street was renamed in honour of the raiders. A museum display explained the operation in detail. When HMS Campbeltown's bell was recovered from the wreck and restored, it became a centrepiece of local military history. The technical aftermath of the raid provided valuable lessons for both sides. British planners realised that motor launches, despite their crew's courage, were simply too vulnerable for opposed landings. Future operations would require better armoured landing craft. The development of landing craft assault and landing craft infantry owed much to the bloody lessons learned on the Loire estuary. The concept of using an explosive-filled ship as a guided missile inspired later operations, though none matched St. Nazaire's success. German defensive doctrine changed significantly. The raid exposed weaknesses in their coastal defence system. Recognition codes could be compromised. Searchlights could be turned on too late. Defensive fire lacked coordination. In the crucial minutes when Campbeltown approached the dock, different German units were firing independently without unified command. Some batteries held fire waiting for clear identification, while others engaged immediately. The confusion allowed Campbeltown to close the final mile with less opposition than she should have faced. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commanding the U-boat fleet, was furious. His submarines depended on St. Nazaire's facilities. The loss of the Normandie dock was bad enough, but the destruction of pumping stations, workshops and support facilities crippled the port's usefulness. Submarines returning from patrol now had to proceed to other bases, adding days to their voyage and reducing operational efficiency. Dönitz demanded a full investigation into how British forces had penetrated so deeply into a supposedly secure harbour. The investigation revealed uncomfortable truths. French resistance had provided the British with detailed intelligence about German defences. Someone had photographed the dock installations and smuggled the pictures to London. Someone had counted German troops and mapped their positions. Someone had timed the searchlight patterns and noted their blind spots. The Germans launched a brutal crackdown, arresting suspected resistance members throughout the region. Many were tortured, some were executed, others disappeared into concentration camps. The resistance paid a heavy price for the raid's success, a price that British planners had anticipated but could not prevent. The strategic impact extended far beyond the immediate: destruction. Hitler's directive for the construction of the Atlantic Wall, issued in December 1941, accelerated after Saint-Nazaire. If the British could attack a heavily defended port and destroy critical infrastructure, nowhere on the coast was safe. The massive construction program that followed consumed enormous resources. Concrete, steel, labour, weapons, all diverted from other fronts to build bunkers and gun positions along thousands of miles of coastline. The organisation TOT, responsible for construction, employed hundreds of thousands of workers. Much of the cement used in the Atlantic Wall might otherwise have gone to building shelters in German cities or fortifications on the Eastern Front. From a purely economic standpoint, Operation Chariot achieved a remarkable return on investment. The raid cost Britain 1 old destroyer, 18 motor launches, and 169 lives, a terrible cost in human terms but modest in material terms. The Germans were forced to spend billions of Reichsmarks and millions of man-hours fortifying their entire Atlantic coast against similar raids. Every gun emplacement built in Norway because of Saint-Nazaire was a gun not deployed in Russia. Every concrete bunker in France was concrete not used elsewhere. The strategic leverage was enormous. The raid's propaganda value proved equally significant. In March 1942, the war news was unrelentingly grim for Britain. Singapore had fallen. Rommel was advancing in North Africa. German U-boats were sinking merchant ships faster than they could be replaced. The Soviet Union was reeling from German offensives. Britain needed a victory, something to prove they could strike back effectively. Saint-Nazaire provided that victory. The BBC broadcast news of the raid within days, though full details remained classified for weeks. Newspapers ran headlines celebrating the daring attack. The Ministry of Information released stories emphasising the raiders' courage and the operation's success. When the Victoria Crosses were announced, public response was overwhelming. Here were heroes who had struck deep into German-held territory and achieved their objective against impossible odds. American newspapers picked up the story. The United States had been at war for only 4 months. American forces had suffered defeat at Bataan and were retreating across the Pacific. The Saint-Nazaire raid demonstrated that the Allies could take the offensive, that German defences were not impregnable, that courage and planning could overcome material disadvantages. The boost to morale in both Britain and America exceeded the operation's material impact. German propaganda tried to spin the raid as a failed British attempt to invade France, claiming that all attackers had been killed or captured. But the destruction of the Normandie dock could not be hidden. Neutral journalists in Vichy, France reported the damage. Aerial reconnaissance photographs taken by RAF Spitfires showed the shattered caisson and flooded dock. Within weeks, the truth was known throughout occupied Europe. The Germans had been hurt badly on their own ground. The technical achievement of the raid's planning deserves examination. Combined Operations Headquarters, led by Lord Louis Mountbatten, had coordinated an extraordinarily complex operation involving multiple services and specialised units. The Royal Navy provided the vessels and navigational expertise. The Army contributed the commandos and demolition specialists. The RAF supplied diversionary bombing, though that aspect failed, and photo reconnaissance. Intelligence services provided detailed information about the target. Each element required precise coordination. The intelligence preparation was particularly impressive. Aerial photographs revealed the dock's layout, but not the location of guards, searchlights, or gun positions. That information came from French resistance sources who risked their lives gathering details. One resistance member, a dock worker sketched the pump house interiors from memory, noting pipe locations and machinery types. His sketches allowed demolition teams to plan exactly where to place charges for maximum effect. He was arrested by the Gestapo 3 weeks after the raid and died in custody. The rehearsals demonstrated British attention to detail. A full-scale mock-up of the dock area was constructed on the southern coast. Commandos practiced their assault until they could move through the target area blindfolded. Demolition teams drilled their procedures until they could place and arm charges in complete darkness under simulated fire. Each man knew not only his own job but his teammates' jobs, allowing them to continue if casualties occurred. The training paid off when things went wrong and improvisation became necessary. The selection of Lieutenant Commander Beatty to command Campbeltown reflected careful personnel decisions. Beatty had experience in destroyers and was known for unflappable calm under pressure. He was young enough to handle the physical stress but experienced enough to make quick decisions. He had to be someone willing to ram his ship into a dock gate, knowing he would be abandoning her to enemy hands. Not every officer could reconcile that psychological burden with their training to preserve their vessel. Similarly, Lieutenant Colonel Newman's selection was deliberate. He was not a career military officer, but a civilian engineer who understood structures and demolitions. His engineering background meant he could evaluate whether objectives were truly destroyed or merely damaged. When wounded men reported completing demolitions, Newman could ask the right technical questions to verify success. He combined military leadership with technical expertise, a rare combination that proved essential. The equipment development specifically for the raid included innovations that influenced later operations. The delayed action fuses used in Campbeltown's bow were a new design, reliable enough, to detonate hours after placement but resistant to shock and seawater. The shaped charges used against the pump houses were optimized for cutting thick steel and concrete. The assault ladders and demolition packs were custom built for the Commandos' specific needs. The medical planning was equally thorough. Each motor launch carried a medical orderly with supplies for treating gunshot wounds and burns. Morphine syrettes allowed wounded men to self-administer pain relief. Every commando carried a field dressing. The planners knew casualties would be heavy and prepared accordingly. When the plan collapsed and most motor launches were destroyed, the medical supplies went down with them. The wounded had to rely on what little each man carried personally. The navigational challenge deserved special recognition. Commander Ryder had to guide his flotilla 400 miles across the Atlantic, locate a submarine beacon in darkness, and then thread 5 miles up a treacherous estuary without running aground. The Loire's shifting sandbanks and strong tides made navigation difficult even in peacetime with full charts and daylight. Ryder accomplished it in darkness, under fire while being illuminated by searchlights. His motorgun boat drew 8 feet of water, leaving minimal clearance over some sections of the channel. One navigation error and the entire operation would have ended with the command vessel stuck on a mudflat. The motor launch commanders faced even worse conditions. Following Campbeltown in column, they had to maintain formation while avoiding obstacles, defending themselves against German fire and preparing to land commandos at precise locations. Many of these officers were in their early 20s, commanding boats with volunteer crews who understood they might not survive the night. The casualty rate among motor launch personnel exceeded 60%. Of the 353 Royal Navy personnel who sailed from Falmouth, 105 died and another 106 were captured. The chaplain who blessed the flotilla before departure had understood the odds. Speaking privately with Commander Ryder, he asked if the men knew they were unlikely to return. Ryder replied that every man was a volunteer who had been fully briefed on the risks. The chaplain nodded and said he would pray for them. When Ryder asked what prayer he might offer, the chaplain answered simply, that they may die well. It was not the comfort Ryder had hoped for, but it was honest. The families left behind had no such honesty. Operational security meant that wives, parents and children knew only that their loved ones had departed on operations. When casualties were reported, the standard telegram arrived. The Admiralty regrets to inform you, or the War Office regrets to inform you. Families learned that their son or husband had been killed or was missing in action. The details were classified. Where had they died? How had they died? What had they been doing? These questions could not be answered while the war continued. Some families received information from unexpected sources. When the first prisoner exchanges occurred, returning wounded brought news of men held in German camps. A letter might arrive saying, I met your son in Stalagsfist B. He is well, and asked me to tell you not to worry. These informal communications meant everything to families desperate for information. The official Red Cross list took months to compile and distribute. The widows faced particular hardship. Military pensions were modest, barely sufficient for survival. Many women with children were forced to work in factories or take in lodgers. The honour of having a husband who died heroically did not pay rent or buy food. Some remarried within years, seeking financial security as much as companionship. Others remained single, devoted to the memory of men they had married in their youth and lost before their time. The children who lost fathers grew up with idealised memories of men they barely knew. A 5-year-old whose father died at Saint-Nazaire might remember a man in uniform saying goodbye, nothing more. These children built their father's images from photographs, medals and stories told by relatives. Some felt proud, others felt angry that their fathers had chosen duty over family. Most felt confusion that lasted into adulthood. In 1947, when Commander Ryder published his book about the raid, many families finally learned what their loved ones had done. Reading about the attack on the Normandie dock, the desperate fighting through Saint-Nazaire's streets, the motor launches burning on the river, gave context to their loss. It did not make the pain disappear, but it provided meaning. Their sons and husbands had died for a reason, achieving an objective that mattered to the war effort. The annual reunions of the Saint-Nazaire Society became important events for survivors and families alike. Men who had fought together but been separated by capture or evacuation could finally compare their experiences. The widow of a motor launch commander met the commando her husband had landed under fire. The son of a man killed when Campbeltown exploded met Beatty and could ask what his father's final minutes had been like. Beatty, despite his own modesty, always took time to tell families that their loved ones had been brave, that they had done their duty, that they were not forgotten. The French town of Saint-Nazaire began hosting its own commemorations. British veterans were invited as honoured guests. German veterans sometimes attended as well, creating awkward but ultimately healing encounters. Men who had tried to kill each other found they could share respect decades later. A German officer, who had commanded a searchlight position, told a British commando that he had been terrified during the raid, that the British seemed unstoppable, that he had nightmares about it for years afterward. The commando replied that he had been equally terrified and equally haunted. They shook hands and shared a drink. The historical analysis of Operation Chariot continued for decades. Military colleges studied it as an example of successful raiding operations. The clear objective, detailed planning, and acceptance of casualties to achieve strategic goals became textbook examples. But analysts also noted the operation's unique circumstances. The Normandie dock was a single-point target. Destroying it required destroying one caisson. Most military objectives were not so conveniently vulnerable to a single blow. The debate over whether similar operations could succeed in modern warfare continues. Improved surveillance makes surprise harder to achieve. Modern weapons are more lethal than 1942 German defensive guns. But the core principles remain valid. Know your objective. Plan meticulously. Train thoroughly. Accept risks. Execute aggressively. These lessons transcend technology and remain relevant to special operations forces worldwide. The veterans themselves had mixed feelings about being celebrated as heroes. Many insisted they were simply doing their jobs, following orders, hoping to survive. The concept of heroism seemed grandiose to men who remembered being scared, confused, and desperate. They pointed out that luck played an enormous role. A German searchlight operator who looked the wrong direction at the crucial moment allowed Campbeltown to get closer before being illuminated. A shell that missed by inches meant survival instead of death. Was that heroism or fortune? But others recognized that heroism involves fear overcome by duty. The motor launch commanders who made repeated attempts to land commandos despite being shot to pieces were not fearless. They were terrified. They continued because their orders required it, and their passengers depended on them. That is heroism in its purest form, doing what must be done despite fear, pain, and knowledge that you will probably die. The Saint-Nazaire Raid stands as one of World War II's most perfectly executed special operations. Despite the loss of most motor launches, despite the evacuation plan's failure, despite capturing most of the assault force, the mission succeeded completely. The Normandie dock was destroyed, and remained unusable for the war's duration. Tirpitz never entered the Atlantic. The strategic objective was achieved. The cost was terrible. 169 men died. Another 215 spent years in German captivity. Hundreds of British families mourned losses. French civilians were killed in German reprisals. But wars are measured in outcomes, not intentions. Operation Chariot removed a strategic asset from German hands, forced the reallocation of enemy resources to coastal defence, and proved that aggressive action could achieve results that defensive strategy never could. In 2007, the remaining survivors gathered for what they knew would be their last major reunion. They were in their 80s and 90s, old men whose bodies bore the scars of that March night 65 years earlier. They stood, as straight as age allowed, while a Royal Marine Band played. They saluted when the names of the dead were read. They wept, unashamed, for friends lost long ago. One survivor, asked what he wanted people to remember about St. Nazaire, thought carefully before answering. Remember that ordinary men can do extraordinary things when the cause is just and the need is great. We were not supermen. We were clerks and farmers and shopkeepers in uniform, but we had a job to do, and we did it. That is all. That simple statement captures the raid's essence. Ordinary men, extraordinary circumstances, duty fulfilled. The Normandie dock caisson that Campbeltown destroyed was eventually replaced after the war, but the new structure was built by French engineers for French purposes, not by German forces for German purposes. That distinction mattered. The dock that serviced passenger liners in peace was never used to repair battleships bent on England's destruction. That was the objective. That was what 169 men died to accomplish. History judges they succeeded completely.